You pour yourself a drink, and somewhere behind your eyes sits a rule so obvious it doesn't even feel like a rule. You would never, ever hand this glass to a child. Hold on to that certainty, because for almost the entire history of your species, that instinct would have gotten you laughed out of the village. Not frowned at, laughed at. The way you'd laugh at someone who refused to give a kid water. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. That rule in your head, the one that feels ancient, permanent, carved into the bones of what it means to be a good parent, is younger than your great-great-grandmother. It's one of the newest ideas humans have ever had. And to understand how new it is, you have to go back. Not a few hundred years, not a few thousand, 10 million. That's where this starts. Long before farms, long before fire pits and villages and the first cup ever carved from stone, before there was anything you'd recognize as a person at all. And the question we're climbing toward, the one that doesn't get answered until the very end, is simple and strange. When did drinking begin? And when did giving it to a child stop being normal and start being a crime? Stay with me, because the answer is going to rearrange something you thought you understood about your own family tree. Let's climb. Picture a forest 10 million years ago. Warm, thick, loud with insects. And down on the ground, not up in the branches where you'd expect, an animal that is not quite an ape and not remotely a human, but is unmistakably your ancestor. The shared grandparent of you and chimpanzees and gorillas. One creature, one bloodline, before the split. And this ancestor is doing something that should have made it sick. It's eating rotten fruit. Fruit that fell days ago. Fruit that's soft and brown and bubbling faintly. Because wild yeast has been feeding on its sugars and turning them into something else. Alcohol. That fruit on the forest floor isn't just food. It's the first bar in history. And nobody built it. It built itself. Now, for most animals, that's a problem. Alcohol is a poison. Your body treats it like a threat and races to break it down before it does damage. And the very first tool that touches it when it hits your gut is an enzyme with a boring name, ADH4. Here's where it gets extraordinary. In 2015, a scientist named Matthew Kerrigan published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected journals on Earth. And Kerrigan did something that sounds like science fiction. He resurrected the dead. Not people, enzymes. His team took the ADH4 gene from dozens of living primates, traced it backward across nearly 70 million years of the family tree, and rebuilt the ancient versions of that enzyme in the lab, working copies of a molecule that hadn't existed since before humans did. Then they tested each one. How well does this ancient enzyme break down alcohol? For most of those 70 million years, the answer was badly. Our tree-dwelling ancestors could barely process ethanol at all. A few pieces of fermented fruit would have left them dizzy, sick, and easy prey. And then, right around 10 million years ago, one letter in the genetic code changes, a single mutation. And that one tiny edit makes the ADH4 enzyme 40 times better at breaking down alcohol. 40 times. Overnight in evolutionary terms. Think about that for a second. Not a slow drift, a switch flipped. And the timing is the part that should give you chills. That mutation appears at almost exactly the moment our ancestors were climbing down out of the trees to live on the ground, where the fallen, fermenting fruit was. The paper was handled for the journal by Robert Dudley, a biologist at UC Berkeley who'd spent years arguing for what he called the drunken monkey idea, that our pull toward alcohol was never a modern vice. It was a survival tool. The smell of alcohol meant ripe, high-calorie food nearby. Following that smell kept you alive. So the creature that could hold its drink got more to eat. And the creature that got more to eat had more babies. And 10 million years later, here you are, pouring a glass, obeying a body that was tuned for this before your species had a name. Let that sink in. You didn't learn to drink. You inherited it from an animal that's been dead for 10 million years, that never saw a human face, and that would recognize the pull you feel toward that glass more clearly than it would recognize almost anything else about you. If you're enjoying uncovering these forgotten truths, the ones hiding under the most ordinary things you do, subscribe now, because the next discovery didn't just push the story back further, it flipped what scientists believed about which came first, our farms or our thirst. Here's the loop that's now wide open. 10 million years explains why we can drink. It explains the machinery in your gut, but it explains nothing about why an ancient parent would look at a small child and decide the safest thing in the world to put in that child's hands was a cup of something fermented. That decision isn't 10 million years old. It's much closer. And to find where it begins, we have to leave the forest floor behind and walk into a cave in the hills above what's now northern Israel, where somebody 13,000 years ago did something that wasn't supposed to be possible for another 5,000. The cave is called Rakafet. It sits in the Carmel Hills, and 13,000 years ago, the people who used it weren't farmers. They couldn't have been. Farming didn't exist yet. These were the Natufians, hunter-gatherers, foragers, people who lived off what the land gave them and moved with it. By every rule of the story we were taught, they should have been thousands of years too early to do what they did. They brewed beer. In 2018, an archaeologist named Lee Liu from Stanford, working with Danny Nadell of the University of Haifa, published the finding in the Journal of Archaeological Science, Reports. They'd analyzed 3 stone mortars carved into the floor of the cave, deep, heavy basins cut straight into the bedrock, and in the residue scraped from inside them, they found the microscopic fingerprints of malting, grains of wheat and barley that had been soaked, sprouted, mashed, and left to ferment. This, Liu said plainly, is the oldest record of man-made alcohol in the world. Now, here's what makes that finding so important. For over 60 years, archaeologists have argued about one deceptively simple question. Why did humans start farming at all? Why would anyone trade the freedom of foraging for the back-breaking grind of planting, tending, and harvesting grain? The obvious answer was always bread. We farmed to eat. But Rakafet cracks that answer open. Because here's beer, real, brewed, intentional beer, sitting before the fields, before the bread. The people making it hadn't settled down to grow grain yet, and they were already turning grain into alcohol. Which raises a possibility that sounds like a joke until you sit with it. What if we didn't build farms to make bread? What if we built them to keep the beer coming? Beer before bread. Let that sink in for a second, because it inverts the entire origin story of civilization. The thing you were told was a luxury might have been the engine. And notice what's not here yet. There's no bar, no tavern, no idea of a drink as something you do to relax at the end of a hard day. The Natufians didn't brew this beer to unwind. They brewed it, the evidence suggests, for the dead. Rakafet was a burial cave, and the beer appears woven into the rituals they held for the people they buried there. This was sacred, communal, a thing you made when it mattered most. So already, the picture is wrong. We imagine our ancestors as either grim survivors or drunken brutes. But these people carved beer basins into the floor of a graveyard so they could honor their dead properly. That's not recklessness. That's reverence. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Rakafet is a cave, intimate, small, a place for one community and its ghosts. If beer was already this important to a scattered band of foragers 13,000 years ago, important enough to build for, important enough to bury with, then what happens when you gather not one community, but thousands in one place for the first time in human history? The answer is sitting on a hilltop in southern Turkey, and it is enormous. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, and when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began digging there, he found something that broke the timeline. Massive stone pillars, some of them 16 feet tall and weighing tons, carved with foxes and scorpions and vultures, arranged in great rings. 11,000 years old. Older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. Older than Stonehenge. Older than writing. Older than the wheel. Older than the first city. And, this is the part that stops you, older than farming. Again. Built by people who hadn't planted a field. For decades, the assumption about the first monuments was obvious. People settle down. They farm. They get comfortable and organized. And then, with time and surplus on their hands, they build temples to their gods. Civilization first, cathedral second. That was the order. That was the rule. Göbekli Tepe reverses it. Here's the temple, and there's no city around it. No farms, no settlement. The monument comes first, and everything else seems to have grown up around the need to build and feed it. So how do you feed the hundreds, maybe thousands of people it took to haul and carve those stones? You throw a feast. And here's where the researcher Oliver Dietrich comes in. Dietrich and his colleagues studied great limestone vats found at the site, some capable of holding over 40 gallons, and the chemical traces inside them. Their conclusion was careful, but electric. Those vats may have held fermenting grain. Beer, possibly, brewed at a scale no foraging band had ever attempted, to fuel the largest gatherings humanity had yet pulled off. Now, I have to be honest with you, because the honest version is always more interesting than the confident lie. Whether Göbekli Tepe ran on beer is still argued. The residue is suggestive, not certain, and good scientists disagree about it. Nobody can hand you a sealed cup from 11,000 years ago and say, drink this. But look at the shape of what we've got. Rockafet, beer for the dead before the farm. Göbekli Tepe, possibly beer for the crowd before the city. Two of the oldest, strangest things our ancestors ever did. And alcohol keeps turning up at the center of both, thousands of years before anyone was supposed to have it. You could tell yourself this was a fluke. One clever culture in one corner of the world, stumbling onto fermentation and spreading it outward from there. It's a comforting idea. It keeps the story tidy. It's also completely wrong. And to see just how wrong, we have to leave the Middle East entirely and travel to the far side of the planet, to a village in China where somebody, 9,000 years ago, was brewing something no one in that Turkish hilltop had ever heard of. The village is called Jiahu, in the Yellow River Valley of China. 9,000 years ago, 7,000 BCE, someone there was making a drink so specific, so deliberate, that when a chemist finally analyzed its traces thousands of years later, he could practically read the recipe. That chemist is Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and he spent his career doing something nobody else quite does. He's a molecular detective for ancient booze. He takes the invisible residue soaked into the walls of old pottery, runs it through a lab, and reconstructs what people were drinking before anyone could write it down. At Jiahu, the pottery gave him a mix: rice, honey, and fruit, either hawthorn or grape or both, fermented together into a kind of ancient wine-beer hybrid. 9,000 years old, and confirmed not by a guess or a legend, but by chemistry. Now, here's what makes that matter. Jiahu is thousands of miles from Rockafet Cave, thousands of miles from Göbekli Tepe. There were no roads between them, no trade routes, no ships. The people brewing rice and honey wine in China had never met and could never meet the people malting barley in the hills above the Mediterranean. They didn't share a language, a culture, or a single idea, and they all landed on alcohol anyway. Think about what that means. If fermentation had shown up in exactly one place and spread outward, you could call it an invention, a clever trick passed hand to hand. But it didn't. It erupted independently on opposite ends of the earth among people who had no way of teaching each other. Different grains, different fruit, different gods, same discovery. Nobody taught humanity to drink. Every branch of us, everywhere, walked into the same room on its own and found the cup already waiting. And that's the moment the whole thing stops being a story about a beverage. Because a habit that appears everywhere, independently, in people who share nothing, that's not culture. That's deeper than culture. That's the 10-million-year-old enzyme from the forest floor, finally meeting the human mind, and the two of them shaking hands in every corner of the planet at once. So, we've got the machinery, 10 million years old. We've got the craft, at least 13,000 years old and everywhere. But we still haven't touched the thing you came here for. We still haven't answered the question sitting in your chest since the first sentence. When does a child get handed the cup? Here's where everything you assumed goes backwards. Walk into ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago. Find the workers building the pyramids at Giza and look at how they're paid. Not entirely in coins, not in bread alone, in beer. Archaeologists digging the workers' settlements found the bakeries and breweries side by side, industrial in scale, because beer was wages. It was ration. It was the fuel that raised the most famous stones on Earth. And it wasn't what you're picturing. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, low in alcohol, closer to a liquid loaf of bread than to anything you'd order today. It was food you could drink, packed with calories, with nutrients, with the yeast that helped keep you fed. They even had a word for it woven into daily life, henket, and it flowed through the whole society, top to bottom, including to children. Not as a treat, not as a mistake, as nourishment. A growing child in ancient Egypt drank beer the way a child today drinks milk, because it was one of the safest, most caloric, most reliable things a parent could put in front of them. Over in Sumer, the reverence went even further. They wrote a hymn to the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and buried inside that hymn, around 1800 BCE, was a working recipe, a prayer you could brew. Their instructions for making alcohol were literally an act of worship. Now stop and feel how strange this is against everything in your gut. You have spent your whole life inside a rule that says alcohol in children is one of the brightest moral lines there is. Cross it and you're not a bad parent, you're a criminal. And here is one of the greatest civilizations that ever existed, building wonders that still stand 4,500 years later, handing beer to its kids and calling it good parenting. They weren't monsters. They loved their children exactly as fiercely as you love yours. They watched over them, grieved them, wanted them to grow up strong, and every instinct they had told them that the cup of beer was the thing keeping that child alive. So who's right? That's the reversal this whole video has been climbing toward. It's tempting to look back and think, they just didn't know better. The comfortable story is that we're the enlightened ones and they were fumbling in the dark. But that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says they were making a completely rational choice, the correct choice for the world they lived in. And the only reason your instinct screams the opposite is that you were born into a different world. The question is, what changed between their world and yours? What made the safe choice deadly and the deadly choice safe? Because something did, something specific, something that, for almost all of human history, simply wasn't true. The answer is hiding in the one thing every parent in this story was actually afraid of, not the beer, the alternative to the beer. And to see it clearly, we have to leave Egypt, cross into the vineyards of Greece and Rome, and then follow the cup all the way into a European village where the water itself was trying to kill your children. Cross the Mediterranean into ancient Greece, and you'll find people who thought about drinking more carefully than almost anyone before them, and who would have found your drinking habits genuinely disturbing. Because to a Greek, the way you drink wine is barbaric. Not because you drink it, because you drink it straight. Undiluted wine, wine poured from the bottle into the glass and swallowed as is, was to the Greek mind the mark of a savage, a brute, someone with no self-control and no civilization. Proper people didn't do that. Proper people mixed their wine with water in a large communal bowl called a crater, cutting it down, sometimes to 1 part wine, 3 or 4 parts water, before anyone drank a drop. And once it was cut, it was for everyone. The Romans carried the same practice forward. Diluted wine wasn't an indulgence you hid from the children. It was the ordinary table drink of the household, and children drank a weaker version of it as a normal part of growing up. Roman soldiers marched on Pascha, a sharp, watered mix of wine gone half to vinegar, because it was cheap, it traveled, and, crucially, it was safe to drink when the local water wasn't. There it is again, that word, safe. You keep hearing it, station after station, And it's time to say plainly what's been circling underneath this entire video. Every ancestor you've met, the Natufian, the Egyptian, the Greek, the Roman, was making the same calculation, and it had almost nothing to do with wanting to drink. It had to do with what would happen if they didn't. Here's the thing your body has forgotten how to fear. For nearly all of human history, water was the most dangerous thing you could put in a child's mouth. Not sometimes, not in bad years. Always, everywhere there were people living close together. The stream ran past the village that washed in it, dumped into it, buried near it. The well sat downhill from the waste. And the water that came out looked clean, clear, cold, harmless, and carried things no one could see and no one could name. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Diseases that could take a healthy child in a matter of days, hollow them out, and leave a parent holding a body they'd done everything to protect. That was the world. That was the fear underneath every cup in this story. Not a fear of missing out on a drink, a fear of the water itself. A fear that the most basic thing you had to give your child, the thing they needed every single day to live, was also the thing most likely to kill them. And against that fear, our ancestors found a defense: alcohol. Now follow this into medieval and early modern Europe, because this is where it becomes a system. They brewed something called small beer, sometimes called table beer, barely alcoholic, weak enough that you could drink it all day and stay clear-headed, weak enough for children. And they drank it constantly, men, women, and yes, kids, as the default household beverage, morning to night. For centuries, nobody understood why it worked. They just knew, generation after generation, that the family who drank small beer got sick less than the family who drank from the river. So they kept doing it. They'd stumbled, without a shred of science, onto something real. To brew that beer, the water had to be boiled. And though they'd never heard the word germ and had no idea what boiling did, the heat was killing the very things in the water that killed children. The alcohol and the acidity did the rest, holding back new contamination. They were practicing public health blind, running a life-saving experiment they couldn't read the results of, passing the cup to their kids not out of carelessness, but out of the deepest care a parent has, the care that keeps a child breathing another day. So sit with the full weight of it now. That rule in your head, never hand a child a drink, would have struck every one of these people as lunacy. In their world, refusing your child small beer and sending them to the well instead wasn't caution. It was a way to bury them. Which means the moral line you were so sure about at the start of this video isn't a moral line at all. It's a situation. It was only ever about which liquid was trying to kill you. And for 10,000 years running, the answer was always the same one: the water. Until, in the span of a single human lifetime, the answer changed. Everything you've climbed through, the enzyme, the cave, the temple, the pyramids, the watered wine, the small beer, all of it rested on one unspoken fact that had been true for the entire human story: that water was the enemy. And there is a specific place and a specific man and a specific year where that fact finally broke, where humanity learned for the very first time what was actually in the water, and in learning it, quietly dissolved a 10-million-year-old arrangement between us and the cup. After that, the child could drink the water, and the beer became the thing to keep away from them. The place is London. The year is 1854, and the man is a physician named John Snow. That summer, cholera tore through the Soho district, dropping people in days, filling coffins street by street. The best minds of the age blamed bad air, a poisonous mist rising from filth drifting into lungs. It was the accepted truth. It was also completely wrong. Snow didn't believe the air, he believed the water. And instead of arguing, he did something almost nobody had thought to do. He mapped the dead. House by house, death by death, he plotted every case on a map of the neighborhood and watched a pattern rise up out of the ink. The deaths clustered. They ringed a single point like iron filings around a magnet. A public water pump on Broad Street. People walked to that pump, filled their cups, carried it home to their families, to their children, and it was killing them. The story goes that snow convinced the authorities to remove the pump's handle, to make it impossible to draw that water, and the outbreak died with it. And in that moment, something 10 million years in the making came quietly to an end. For the first time in the entire human story, someone had pointed at the water and proven, this is the thing that's been taking your children. Not the air, not fate, the water. The exact enemy every ancestor in this video had been fighting blind for 10,000 years with a cup of something fermented. Now, here's what makes that finding the end of the road. Once you can see the enemy, you can kill it directly. You don't need the beer anymore. In the decades after snow, the world learned to filter water, to treat it, to run clean pipes into homes. The thing that had been trying to murder children since before cities existed was simply switched off, turned harmless, made safe. And the moment the water became safe, the beer became a problem. Do you feel the whole thing invert? For 10,000 years, the equation was fixed. Water dangerous, alcohol protective, child gets the cup. Then, in a single lifetime, a few short generations, clean water arrived, and every term in that equation flipped its sign. Now the water was the safe thing, and the alcohol was the risk. So the rule flipped with it. Handing a child a drink stopped being wisdom and started being harm. And within a generation or two, it hardened into the deepest instinct you own, the one you felt in the very first second of this video, the one that doesn't even feel like a choice. That's the answer to the question we've been holding open the entire way up. When did giving a child alcohol stop being normal and start being a crime? Not in ancient times, not in some slow moral awakening across the centuries. It happened here, after 1854, after clean water, after we finally learned what was in the cup that wasn't beer. The rule you were sure was ancient is younger than the light bulb, younger than the telephone. It is, at most, about 150 years old. And I'll be honest with you, the way this whole climb has tried to be honest, because the truth is better than the tidy version. It's not that our ancestors were fools and we are wise. It's that they were right for their world and we are right for ours. And the only thing that changed between them was a pump handle and a map of the dead. Take away clean water tomorrow, and every instinct you have would flip straight back. You'd hand your child the cup too. You'd be grateful to have it. So pour your drink. Look at the glass in your hand. The pull you feel toward it isn't a modern weakness. It's an inheritance, 10 million years old. Older than fire, older than language, older than your species. Handed down from an animal on a forest floor who followed the smell of fermenting fruit, because that smell meant survival. Every ancestor between that creature and you drank. And nearly every one of them, when they looked at their own child, reached for that same cup and offered it. Not out of neglect, but out of love, out of terror of the water, out of the oldest job a parent has. Keep this small person alive until morning. You are the first humans in the entire 10 million year story who don't have to. The first ones who can hand a child a glass of water and simply trust it. That's not tradition. That's a miracle so new the ink is barely dry. And you drink on top of it every day, without once feeling how strange, how recent, how fragile it is. The pull toward the glass is 10 million years old. The rule that stops you passing it to a child isn't even 200. You are the very first humans in the whole story who get to choose, and you barely know it.